She had always been the quiet one, the sister who stood in the shadows, who handed the embroidery hoop back to her mother without complaint, who stepped aside when the drawing-room doors opened and a duke walked in. For 26 years, Eleanor Ashworth had learned to exist in the spaces no one else wanted. She did not resent it. She had simply accepted that the world saw her the way it saw a piece of well-worn furniture. Useful, dependable, barely worth a second glance. Her sister Lydia was another matter entirely. Lydia, at 20, possessed a radiance that seemed almost unfair, the kind of beauty that made men stop mid-sentence and women tighten their smiles. Golden hair that caught every candle flame. A laugh that sounded like wind through chimes. When the Duke of Ashbourne arrived at their father's country estate that autumn, everyone in the household understood why he had come. The Ashworths were not wealthy. Their name carried weight from a previous century, but the coffers had long since run dry. A marriage between Lydia and a duke would save the family. It was not a secret. It was not even a discussion. It was simply what would happen. Eleanor watched the courtship unfold from the edges of the room, as she always did. She brought tea trays. She kept the younger children occupied during dinner. She ensured that the Duke never saw the frayed edges of the dining room curtains or the way the wallpaper had begun to peel near the window. She was the invisible machinery that kept the household running, and no one thought to thank her for it. But she had seen something the Duke had not. She had seen the storm. The night of his arrival, when the carriage had overturned on the muddy road 2 miles from the estate, when the footman had come running through the rain with a lantern, when everyone had rushed to the window, Eleanor had not rushed. She had moved. While Lydia clutched her mother's arm and wept prettily at the thought of a duke drowning in a ditch, Eleanor had pulled on her oldest cloak and walked into the rain. She found him pinned beneath the carriage wheel, his leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. The horses were still thrashing. The driver was unconscious. The Duke, she did not know his face yet, only his voice, which was surprisingly calm given the circumstances, told her to fetch help. She did not fetch help. She crouched in the mud, braced her shoulder against the carriage frame and lifted. It took 3 tries. On the third, the wheel shifted just enough for him to pull his leg free. He did not see her face that night. The rain was too thick, the lantern too dim, and she had pulled her hood forward to keep the water from her eyes. He asked her name. She said nothing. She helped him into the footman's arms and disappeared back into the darkness before anyone could stop her. The next morning, the story changed. Lydia, who had not left the house, who had not seen the rain or the blood or the unnatural angle of the Duke's leg, told everyone that she had been the one to organize the rescue, that she had sent the footman, that she had been the one to ensure the Duke was safe. Eleanor did not correct her. She could not. To correct her sister would be to reveal that she had been outside, alone in the middle of the night without a chaperone, lifting a carriage wheel like a common laborer. The scandal would destroy whatever chance Lydia had, and so Eleanor stayed silent. She stayed silent when the Duke arrived at the house on crutches, his eyes scanning every face in the room as if searching for someone. She stayed silent when Lydia took his arm and led him to the garden, when the engagement was announced 3 weeks later, when her mother wept with relief and her father shook the Duke's hand with a grip that betrayed his desperation. She stayed silent through the wedding preparations, through the fittings and the flowers and the endless discussions of lace patterns. But the Duke was not silent. He asked questions, small ones at first. He asked Lydia what she remembered about the night of the storm. Lydia told him about the rain, about the footman, about her worry. She told him about organizing the servants. He nodded. He asked again the following week, slightly different phrasing. Lydia repeated herself. He asked a third time, and Eleanor noticed that her sister's answers had begun to fray at the edges, that the details did not quite align, that Lydia was describing a scene she had only imagined. The Duke noticed too. He did not say anything. He was far too careful for that. But Eleanor caught him watching her. Not the way men watched women they found beautiful. She knew that look, had seen it directed at her sister countless times. This was different. This was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle. She dropped her gaze. She brought more tea. She disappeared into the background where she belonged. The wedding was scheduled for the first Saturday of December. November arrived cold and grey, and Eleanor found herself spending more and more time in the kitchen, where the heat from the ovens made the world feel less sharp. She was kneading bread dough. The cook had taught her years ago, and she found the rhythm soothing, when a shadow fell across the table. The Duke was standing in the doorway, not in the grand front entrance where a footman would have announced him. In the kitchen doorway, in his shirt sleeves, his cravat undone, his hair slightly dishevelled. He looked nothing like the polished portrait that hung in the gallery. He said, You were the one in the rain. It was not a question. Eleanor's hand stopped moving. The dough sat beneath her fingers, half kneaded, suddenly heavy. She did not look up. I do not know what you mean, Your Grace. You were the one who lifted the carriage wheel. You were the one who pulled me out. I did not see your face that night, but I have watched you for 3 weeks and I know your hands. He stepped closer. You have the same grip, the same way of moving, the same silence. She wanted to deny it. The words were ready. They were on her tongue, perfectly formed, the same denial she had offered herself every night when she lay awake, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the way he was looking at her. Not with accusation, not with anger, with something closer to wonder. Your sister does not know, he said slowly, that I have been asking her the same questions for weeks, that I have been watching her answers falter, that I have been watching you watch her. She is my sister, Eleanor said. Her voice was barely a whisper. And I am a man who owes his life to someone who will not claim it. He sat down at the table across from her, wincing slightly as he bent his injured leg. Why? She looked at him then. Really looked. He was younger than she had assumed. The title had made him seem older, more distant, carved from marble. But up close in the dim kitchen light, he was just a man with lines around his eyes and a question that would not let him rest. Because if I had told the truth, you would have looked at me differently, she said, and I did not want to be looked at. He did not understand. She could see that. He was a duke. He had been looked at his entire life, admired and resented and studied and feared. He did not know what it meant to be invisible, to prefer it, to grieve it and cling to it at the same time. Your sister is going to marry me, he said quietly. In 3 weeks. She will become a duchess. She will live in a house with 100 rooms. She will never need bread again. I know. And you will remain here, in this kitchen, in this house, invisible. I know. He leaned forward. His voice dropped. I do not think I can marry her. Eleanor's heart stopped. She felt it, a physical sensation, a pause in the rhythm of her chest. She said nothing. Not because she is unworthy, he continued. She is kind. She is beautiful. She will make a fine duchess. But she is not the woman who saved my life, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about the woman who did. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The dough was cold now. The kitchen was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of servants moving through the house. You barely know me, she said. I know that you lifted a carriage wheel. I know that you did not tell anyone. I know that you have been hiding in plain sight for years, and I know that no one has noticed. His voice was raw. I know that I have been searching for you since the moment I woke up in that bed, and I did not even know your name. The door creaked. A footman appeared, red-faced, apologetic. The Duke was needed in the drawing room. Lydia was waiting. Eleanor could hear her sister's voice from the hallway, bright and musical, laughing at something her mother had said. The Duke stood. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he turned and followed the footman out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the cold dough and the echo of his words, and a feeling she had never allowed herself to name. 3 weeks until the wedding. 21 days. And suddenly, for the first time in 26 years, Eleanor Ashworth did not want to be invisible. The days that followed were strange and painful and beautiful in ways she could not fully understand. The Duke did not speak to her again in private. He could not. There was always someone watching, always a servant or a relative or a neighbor dropping by with congratulations. But Eleanor felt his eyes on her across rooms. She felt the weight of his attention like a hand on her spine. She began to stand straighter. She began to meet the gaze of servants who had never looked at her before. Something was shifting beneath the surface of her life, and she did not know if it was hope or danger or both. Lydia noticed nothing. Lydia was too busy being engaged to a duke, too busy trying on gowns and practicing her signature and imagining the life that awaited her. But Eleanor's mother noticed. She found Eleanor in the garden one afternoon, pulling dead leaves from the rose bushes, and stood beside her for a long time before speaking. The Duke has been asking questions, her mother said. Her voice was flat. He is a curious man. He asked me about the night of the storm. He asked me who had gone to find him. I told him the footman had gone alone. Her mother paused. That was not true, was it? Eleanor did not answer. She pulled another leaf from the bush. The thorns scratched her fingers. I saw you come back that night, her mother said quietly. I was at the window. I saw you hand him to the footman. I saw you walk back to the house with mud up to your knees. I said nothing. Then why are you saying something now? Her mother's hand found hers. It was the first time Eleanor could remember her mother touching her with tenderness rather than necessity. Because I think he knows, and I think he is going to choose you. Eleanor looked at her mother, the woman who had spent years pushing Lydia into the light and letting Eleanor fade into the walls. The woman who had not corrected Lydia's lie. The woman who was now looking at her eldest daughter with something like regret. I do not want to be chosen, Eleanor said. I want to be left alone. You do not mean that. Eleanor pulled her hand away. She did not know what she meant. She knew only that the life she had accepted was crumbling around her, and that the alternative, being seen, being wanted, being chosen, was more terrifying than any storm. The first Saturday of December arrived with a sky the color of iron. Snow had fallen the night before, blanketing the estate in white, muffling every sound. The church was decorated with holly and ivy. The guests had arrived from 3 counties. Lydia was radiant in a gown that had cost more than Eleanor's father earned in a year. Eleanor stood at the back of the church, in a grey dress that matched the sky, watching her sister prepare to marry a man who was in love with someone else. She did not know this for certain. She had no evidence, no confession, no proof, but she knew. She had known since the kitchen. She had known since he told her he could not stop thinking about her. The organ began to play. Lydia began to walk down the aisle. Eleanor watched the Duke's face as he watched her sister approach. He was smiling. It was a good smile, a polite smile, a smile that did not reach his eyes. And then he looked past Lydia. He looked to the back of the church, where Eleanor stood in her grey dress, invisible even now, invisible on her sister's wedding day. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a question, a confession, without words. Lydia reached the altar. The priest began to speak. The congregation leaned forward, smiling, waiting for the words that would bind 2 lives together. The Duke did not answer. The silence stretched. A cough from the front pew. A whisper from somewhere behind Eleanor. Lydia's smile began to waver. The Duke turned to face the congregation. His hands were shaking. His voice was not. I cannot do this, he said. The gasp that followed was a physical force, a wave of sound that swept through the church. Lydia's mother rose halfway from her seat. Lydia herself stood frozen, her bouquet trembling. I cannot marry you, the Duke said, turning back to Lydia. His voice was gentle. Because I am in love with someone else, and I have been since the night I arrived. Lydia's face crumpled, not with anger, with confusion. With the dawning realization that she did not know the man standing before her, that she had never asked the right questions, that she had built a future on a foundation of polite fiction. Who? She whispered. The Duke did not answer with words. He turned. He looked toward the back of the church. Every head in the congregation followed his gaze. Eleanor wanted to disappear. She wanted to sink into the stone floor, to become part of the walls, to return to the blessed invisibility she had spent her entire life cultivating. But she could not. The Duke was walking toward her. The entire congregation was watching. Her sister was watching. Her mother was watching, and there were tears in her mother's eyes, and Eleanor did not know if they were tears of shame or relief. The Duke stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. She could see that he was as terrified as she was. I have been looking for you my entire life, he said. I did not know it until you lifted that carriage wheel. I did not know it until I watched you disappear into the rain. I have spent every day since trying to find you again. You found me, Eleanor said. Her voice was barely audible. I have been here the whole time. I know. He smiled. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him. I was not looking in the right places. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold. His were warm. The church was silent, except for the sound of a woman weeping somewhere in the front pew. Lydia, Eleanor realized, and the sound broke something inside her. I cannot ask you to marry me today, the Duke said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It would be cruel to your sister. It would be cruel to your family. But I can tell you the truth, and I can wait as long as you need me to wait. Eleanor looked past him, at her sister, at the ruin of Lydia's wedding day. She saw the look on Lydia's face. Not hatred, not jealousy. Something worse. The hollow realization that she had been living a lie, that she had claimed something that was never hers, that the sister she had overlooked her entire life was more valuable than she had ever known. "I need to speak to her," Eleanor said. The Duke nodded. He released her hand. He stepped back and let her pass. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone. Every eye was on her. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention, and it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She reached her sister. She took both of Lydia's hands in hers. "I did not plan this," she said. "I know," Lydia said. Her voice was small. "I knew the night he arrived. I saw you come back. I saw the mud on your dress. I knew." "Then why did you—" "Because I wanted to be chosen," Lydia said. Tears were streaming down her face. "I wanted to be the one, and I thought if I pretended hard enough, it would become true." Eleanor pulled her sister into an embrace. The congregation watched. The Duke watched. The priest stood frozen at the altar, uncertain what to do with a wedding that had stopped halfway through. "I am sorry," Eleanor whispered. "I am sorry too," Lydia whispered back. "I have spent my entire life taking what belonged to you. I did not even know I was doing it." The wedding did not happen that day. The guests dispersed in a state of shock. Lydia's parents retreated to their rooms. The Duke returned to his estate alone, carrying with him the memory of Eleanor's face in the candlelight. The feel of her hand in his, the promise that she would come to him when she was ready. She did not come quickly. Winter passed. Spring arrived. Eleanor spent the months rebuilding her relationship with her sister, untangling the knot of resentment and affection, and shared history that bound them together. She wrote letters to the Duke. Long letters, careful letters, letters in which she tried to explain who she was and what she wanted and why she was afraid. He wrote back, every week. His letters were warm and patient and full of the same careful attention he had shown her in the kitchen. He told her about his estate, about the tenants he was trying to help, about the library he was restoring. He told her that he was waiting, that he would always wait. In May, Eleanor arrived at his estate. She came alone, without a chaperone, without her family's blessing, without any of the protections that society demanded. She came because she had spent 4 months discovering that invisibility was not safety, that she had been hiding not from the world, but from herself. He met her at the door. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the kitchen, the way he had looked at her at the altar, the way a man looks at something precious he has been searching for his entire life. "I have one condition," he said. "Name it. You must never disappear again. You must never be invisible, not to me." Eleanor smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been seen for the first time and had decided finally that she wanted to stay. "Then turn around," she said, "because I have been standing in plain sight for 26 years, and I would like you to see me now." He turned. He saw her, and he kept seeing her every day for the rest of their lives. But a story that ends at the altar is not a story that has truly begun. The real work, the work that would define them, had not even started. The Duke's name was Alexander Blackwood, and he was a man accustomed to being obeyed. He had inherited the title at 22 when his father had fallen from a horse and broken his neck on a hunting path. In the 8 years since, he had learned to command rooms, to silence critics, to manage an estate that spanned 3 counties and employed hundreds. He had learned to trust no one and to rely on himself entirely. And yet here he was, standing in his own foyer, looking at a woman in a traveling dress who had just told him that she would not be folded into his life like a piece of linen. She had come on her own terms. She meant to stay on them. He offered her tea. She accepted. He offered her a tour of the house. She hesitated. He offered her his hand. She did not take it. "I need you to understand something," she said, settling into a chair in his study, the largest room she had ever sat in, with ceilings that rose into shadow and books that lined every wall. "I have spent my entire life serving other people's plans. I have been the extra hand in the kitchen, the quiet presence in the corner, the sister who does not need anything because she has learned not to want. I do not know how to be the center of anyone's attention. I do not know how to be chosen." He sat across from her, his injured legs stretched out before him. The doctor had said he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He did not care. Every step reminded him of the night she had pulled him from under that wheel. "Then let me teach you," he said. She shook her head. "That is not how love works. You cannot teach someone to be seen. You can only decide to keep looking when it becomes difficult." He understood. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to the same quiet register he had used in the kitchen. "Then I will look. I will look until it becomes natural, until you forget that anyone is watching." She did not believe him. He could see it in the set of her jaw, in the way her hands gripped the armrests of the chair. She had been disappointed too many times. She had learned that promises were made to be broken, that attention was always temporary, that the people who claimed to see her would eventually look away. He would prove her wrong. He had nothing but time and patience and a debt he could never fully repay. The first weeks were awkward. She refused to move into the main wing of the house, choosing instead a small suite near the kitchen where she could hear the servants moving in the morning. She refused to take a lady's maid, insisting she could dress herself. She refused to sit at the head of the table during meals, slipping into the chair farthest from him, as if proximity were a danger she had not yet learned to navigate. He did not push. He learned to find her. He learned that she woke before dawn and walked the garden paths in the grey light, that she preferred the company of the cook to the company of the housekeeper, that she read by candlelight late into the night, books borrowed from his library without asking. He learned that she hummed when she thought no one was listening, and that the tune was always something slow and sad. He learned to sit in the same room without expecting conversation. He learned that silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was the sound of trust being built, brick by brick, breath by breath. One evening in June, he found her in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil. She was planting rosemary. The sun was setting and the light caught the side of her face, and he thought he had never seen anything so beautiful. "May I join you?" he asked. She looked up, surprised. "You will ruin your boots." "They can be cleaned." He sat down on the grass beside her, ignoring the mud that immediately soaked through his trousers. She handed him a trowel. He took it. They planted rosemary together in silence, and when they were done, she looked at him with something new in her eyes, something that was not quite trust yet, but was close. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I promised I would look." "But why? You could have any woman in England." "You could have my sister. She would have been a perfect duchess. I am—" She stopped. She did not know how to finish the sentence. "You are the woman who lifted a carriage wheel," he said. "You are the woman who did not ask for thanks. You are the woman who has been hiding in plain sight for 26 years, and I am the man who finally found her. That is why." She looked down at her hands covered in soil, strong and capable and unadorned. "I do not know how to be a duchess." "Then do not be one," he said. "Be Eleanor, that is all I have ever wanted." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a sound so unexpected and genuine that it made his chest ache. It was not a laugh practiced in drawing rooms. It was the laugh of a woman who had not known she could still make such a sound. "You are impossible," she said. "I am determined," he corrected. "There is a difference." Summer deepened. The gardens bloomed. Eleanor began to emerge from her small suite, first for meals, then for walks, then for evenings in the library where he read aloud, and she listened with her eyes closed, her head tilted back, her face relaxed in a way he had never seen before. He did not propose, he did not pressure, he simply stayed. But the world outside the estate was not so patient. Letters arrived from Eleanor's mother, strained and formal, asking when the engagement would be announced. Letters arrived from London, from acquaintances who had heard the rumours, who wanted to know if the Duke had truly jilted Lydia Ashworth for her older sister. Letters arrived from the Countess of Ashbourne's mother, who had not given up hope that her own daughter might still catch his attention, and one letter arrived that Eleanor did not show him. It was from Lydia, short, painful, asking for a meeting. Eleanor read it 3 times in her room, her hands trembling. She had not seen her sister since the wedding that was not. She had written to her several times, but Lydia had not replied. The silence had been a wound that Eleanor carried with her every day. She went to meet her at a small inn halfway between their estates. She did not tell Alexander. She did not want him to worry. She did not want him to try to protect her from a conversation she needed to have alone. Lydia was thinner than Eleanor remembered. Her golden hair was pulled back severely, without the curls and ribbons that had once framed her face. She was wearing a dress that had clearly been altered, the fabric faded at the seams. "You look well," Lydia said. The words were flat. "I am well," Eleanor said. She sat down across from her sister. The inn was quiet. A fire crackled in the hearth. "How are you?" "How do you think I am?" Eleanor did not flinch. She had spent months learning not to flinch. "I think you are angry. I think you are hurt. I think you have every right to be both." Lydia's composure cracked, her face twisted. "You took everything from me." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "You took something from me first. You took the night of the storm. You took the rescue. You took the story and made it yours. I let you. I should not have. But I did not take anything from you that was not already built on a lie. Lydia stared at her. The fire popped. A log shifted. He never loved me, Lydia said finally. I know that now. I knew it then in the church when he looked past me. I knew it when he turned around. I have spent months convincing myself otherwise, but I knew. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. Be honest. Lydia's voice was sharp. Do you love him? Eleanor did not hesitate. Yes. Does he love you? He says he does. Do you believe him? Eleanor thought of the garden, of the rosemary, of his hands in the dirt beside hers, of the way he looked at her when she did not know she was being watched, of the way he had waited, patient and unshakable, while she learned to trust the sunlight. Yes, she said. I believe him. Lydia nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unladylike that Eleanor almost smiled. Then you should marry him, Lydia said, and you should not feel guilty, and you should not look back. Eleanor reached across the table and took her sister's hand. Lydia did not pull away. I will always look back, Eleanor said. You are my sister, but I will not look back with regret. I will look back with love. They sat together until the fire burned low. They spoke of small things, of childhood memories, of the summer their father had taken them to the sea, and Lydia had fallen off a pier, and Eleanor had jumped in after her without thinking, of the way Lydia had always been afraid of the dark, and how Eleanor had left her door open every night until she fell asleep. They did not speak of the Duke. They did not need to. When Eleanor returned to the estate, Alexander was waiting for her on the front steps. The sun was setting, the sky was the color of bruised fruit. You went to see her without telling me, he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the fear beneath it. I needed to do it alone. You should have told me. I know. She climbed the steps and stood in front of him. But I am not your property, Alexander. I am not a possession you need to protect. I am a woman who is learning to make her own choices. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, slowly, the way he had smiled in the church. I know, he said. That is why I love you. She kissed him then. It was the first time she had kissed him, the first time she had initiated anything between them. It was not a perfect kiss. It was a little too fast, a little too startled. A kiss that spoke of inexperience and longing, and the terrifying joy of being wanted. When they pulled apart, he was laughing. What? She asked. I have been waiting for months for you to do that, he said. I was beginning to think I would have to wait forever. You would have waited, she said. It was not a question. I would have waited forever, he said. I told you I am determined. The engagement was announced in August. It was a quiet affair by the standards of the nobility. No grand ball, no announcement in the London papers, just a private dinner at the estate with Eleanor's family present and a simple ring that had belonged to Alexander's mother. Eleanor's father wept. Her mother sat in stunned silence, as if she could not quite believe that the daughter she had overlooked had become a duchess. Lydia was not there. She had written to say she was happy for them, and Eleanor believed her. The wedding took place in September, in the same church where the first wedding had been called off. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue, not white, not ivory, but the color of the sky after rain. Alexander wore the same dark coat he had worn that day in the church, because he said it had brought him luck. The ceremony was short. The vows were simple. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander took Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her with the tenderness of a man who had been searching his entire life for a woman who turned out to have been standing in the mud, in the rain, in the darkness, waiting for him to see. They returned to the estate as the sun was setting. The gardens were golden. The servants had lined up to greet them, and Eleanor noticed with a pang of emotion that the cook was crying. She turned to Alexander. I do not know how to be a duchess. Then learn, he said, together with me. And so she learned. She learned to manage a household, not by commanding but by asking. She learned to speak to tenants and merchants and visiting lords, not with the polished confidence of a woman born to power, but with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned it. She learned that the invisibility she had carried for so long had given her a gift. She saw people. She saw the maid who was overworked, the footman who was ill, the cook who was grieving. She saw them because she had been them. She transformed the estate, not with grand gestures, but with small ones. She insisted that the servants eat the same food as the family. She opened the library to the village children. She planted a garden that anyone could walk through, regardless of rank. And every night, Alexander watched her with the same wonder he had shown in the kitchen. the wonder of a man who had stumbled upon a treasure he had not known he was seeking. "You have changed everything," he told her one evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the stars emerge. "No," she said, "I have simply stopped hiding." He took her hand, his fingers intertwined with hers. "Then I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never want to hide again." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars were bright. The night was warm. She had been invisible for 26 years, and now she was seen, and the seeing was not a punishment or a burden or a spotlight she wished to escape. It was a home, but happiness in a story is not the same as happiness in a life. The marriage was real. The love was real. But the world did not stop turning simply because Eleanor Ashworth had found her place in it. The challenges that came after were different from the ones she had faced before. They were not about survival. They were about transformation. The first test arrived in October, when the London season began to stir and the invitations started arriving. Alexander had been avoiding society since the summer, citing his injured leg, his need to recover, his desire for privacy. But the truth was simpler. He did not want to share her. He did not want to watch the Ton dissect her, judge her, whisper about the servant girl Duchess who had stolen her sister's groom. Eleanor knew this. She felt it in the way he hesitated before handing her the stack of engraved cards, in the way his jaw tightened when she read the names aloud. "We cannot hide forever," she said. "We can try." She laughed, but her eyes were serious. "Your people need to see me. They need to know that their Duchess is not a ghost. They need to know that you did not make a mistake." "I made no mistake," he said, and his voice was firm. "But I am not ready to watch them be cruel to you." "Let them be cruel," she said. "I have survived worse than a few whispered insults. I survived the rain. I survived the mud. I survived watching my sister prepare to marry the man I loved. I can survive a ballroom." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He did not say what he was thinking, but she knew. He was thinking that she was stronger than he had ever been, that she had always been stronger, that he was the one who needed protection, not her. The ball was held at the home of the Marquis of Aldridge, a man whose fortune rivaled Alexander's and whose wife had been one of the loudest voices spreading rumours about the new Duchess of Ashbourne. The invitation had been a test. Everyone knew it. If Eleanor refused, the rumours would be confirmed. If she accepted, the vultures would descend. She accepted. She wore a gown of deep green velvet, the colour of pine needles in winter, with sleeves that brushed her wrists and a neckline that was modest but elegant. She had refused the seamstress's suggestions for more daring cuts, more vibrant colours, more obvious displays of wealth. She would not pretend to be something she was not. Alexander wore black. He stood beside her as their carriage approached the Marquess's townhouse, his hand resting on hers, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "You do not have to do this," he said. "Yes, I do. I know. But I needed to say it anyway." She squeezed his hand. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door, and Eleanor Ashworth, the invisible sister, the woman who had spent 26 years in the shadows, stepped into the light of 100 chandeliers and 1,000 watchful eyes. The room fell silent. It was not a dramatic silence. It was the silence of people who had been expecting a spectacle and were unsure how to react when the spectacle did not arrive. She was not awkward. She was not ashamed. She was simply there, standing beside her husband, her chin lifted, her hands steady, her eyes meeting the gaze of every person who dared to stare. The Marquis of Aldridge approached first. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with a face that had been hardened by decades of political manoeuvring. He bowed. She curtsied. The exchange was formal, correct, devoid of warmth. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Alexander, "we were beginning to wonder if you had abandoned society entirely." "I had no intention of abandoning anything," Alexander replied, "merely taking time to attend to matters at home." The Marquis's eyes slid to Eleanor. "And this must be the new Duchess. We have heard so much about you." "I hope what you have heard is accurate," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm. It surprised even her. The Marquis smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "The accounts have been varied. Then I shall give you the opportunity to form your own opinion." It was the right response. She had practiced it with Alexander a dozen times. Do not defend. Do not explain. Simply stand your ground and let them come to you. The Marquis blinked, slightly thrown, and then inclined his head and moved on. The evening was a progression of such moments. Women who stared too long. Men who asked pointed questions about her family, her upbringing, her qualifications for the role she had assumed. a dowager countess who made a pointed remark about the importance of breeding, a young lord who asked, with mock innocence, whether she missed the simplicity of country life. Each time Eleanor responded with the same quiet steadiness. She did not rise to the bait. She did not falter. She simply remained herself, and in doing so, she disarmed them. But it was not easy. She could feel the sweat gathering at the back of her neck. She could feel the strain in her jaw from smiling. She could feel the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every unkind laugh that was quickly stifled when she turned. At one point, she excused herself to the retiring room. She stood in front of a mirror, gripping the edge of the marble basin, breathing slowly. Her reflection looked back at her, the green dress, the pinned hair, the faint flush on her cheeks. She looked like a duchess, but she did not feel like one. The door opened. A woman entered. She was older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and a face that was kind rather than beautiful. She did not speak at first. She simply stood beside Eleanor at the mirror and smoothed her own hair. "You are doing well," the woman said finally. Eleanor turned. "I beg your pardon." "I said you are doing well. I have been watching you all evening. You have not flinched once." The woman smiled. "I am Lady Winthrop. My husband is the Earl of Winthrop. I have been attending these events for 30 years, and I can tell you with certainty that you have handled yourself better than most women who were born to it." Eleanor did not know what to say. She had spent the evening preparing for hostility. She had not prepared for kindness. "They will test you for another year," Lady Winthrop continued. "Perhaps two. They will look for weakness. They will look for cracks. But if you keep standing the way you are standing now, they will eventually grow bored and move on to someone else." "And if I cannot keep standing?" Lady Winthrop laughed. It was a warm sound. "Then you find a corner and you sit down. And you remember that the people who matter will not care whether you curtsied correctly. And the people who care are not worth your time." She touched Eleanor's shoulder gently, a gesture of solidarity, and then she left. Eleanor stood alone in the retiring room for another minute. Then she straightened her dress, lifted her chin, and walked back into the ballroom. The night wore on. The whispers did not stop, but they grew quieter. By midnight, Eleanor had spoken to half the room, and half the room had found her to be not the monster they had expected, but a woman of calm intelligence and surprising wit. She did not win them over completely. That would take months, years. But she planted a seed. Alexander found her on the terrace after midnight, her hands resting on the stone balustrade, her face tilted up to the stars. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified. That is what made it magnificent." He stood beside her. The night was cold, and he draped his coat over her shoulders. She leaned into him, grateful for his warmth, grateful for his presence, grateful for the quiet that finally surrounded them after hours of noise. "I do not think I will ever belong here," she said. "Then we will not belong here together," he replied. "We will build our own world, one that we both belong to." She closed her eyes. She believed him. She had learned to believe him. The months that followed were not without setbacks. There were invitations that did not come. There were doors that remained closed. There was a morning in November when Eleanor woke to find a letter slipped under her door, unsigned, containing a single sentence. "You are not one of us." She read it. She folded it. She put it in the fire. She did not tell Alexander. She did not need to. She knew that the world was full of people who would try to make her feel small. She had spent 26 years learning to shrink. She was done shrinking. In December, he gave her a gift that changed everything. He gave her a servant she could trust, but not in the way she expected. She was a young woman no older than 18, with dark skin and steady hands and a gaze that did not waver. Her name was Eliza, and she had been born on a plantation in Jamaica before being brought to England as an indentured servant. She had purchased her freedom 5 years ago with money she had saved from mending dresses. Eleanor met her in the kitchen, where Eliza had been hired as a seamstress. Alexander had arranged it without telling her, because he had noticed that she struggled with the protocol of dressing, with the layers and the hooks and the etiquette of being presented. But Eliza was more than a seamstress. She was a woman who had built herself from nothing, who had transformed her circumstances through sheer will, and who understood better than anyone what it meant to be underestimated. They became friends. It was not a formal friendship. It was the kind that grew slowly in quiet moments, over the fitting of a gown or the hemming of a sleeve. Eliza told Eleanor about the plantation where she had been born, about the ocean crossing, about the family she had left behind. Eleanor told Eliza about the carriage wheel, about the rain, about the years of invisibility. "You and I are not so different," Eliza said one afternoon. We have both spent our lives being seen as less than we are. I never lifted a carriage on a plantation, Eleanor said. No, but you lifted your sister's lies. You lifted your family's expectations. You lifted the weight of a life that was never meant to be yours. Eliza smiled. That is not so different. Eleanor looked at her hands. They were no longer the hands of a woman who needed bread. They were softer now, paler, adorned with a ring that had cost more than most people earned in a year. But they were still the same hands. They had lifted a carriage wheel. They had pulled a duke from the mud. They had held her sister in the church. What do I do now? Eleanor asked. You live, Eliza said. You live the life you fought for, and you do not apologize for it. It was the simplest advice Eleanor had ever received, and it was the truest. In the spring, Alexander took her to the sea. They traveled for 3 days, stopping at inns and villages, speaking to tenants and farmers. He wanted her to see the full extent of his estate, the land that would one day be theirs to pass on. She watched him with the people, the way he remembered names, the way he asked after children, the way he crouched down to speak to a small boy who had lost his father to a fever. You are a good man, she told him one night as they sat by a fire in a small inn. I am trying to be, he said. I did not learn it on my own. I learned it from watching you. The next morning they reached the coast. The sea was grey and vast, stretching to the horizon, endless and terrifying and beautiful. Eleanor stood on the cliffs and felt the wind pull at her hair, and she thought of all the years she had spent in small rooms, in shadowed corners, in the narrow world of her father's estate. I never knew the world was this wide, she said. Alexander stood behind her, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. It is wider than you can imagine, he said, and we have a lifetime to explore it together. She turned in his arms. The wind was cold, the sea was loud, but she felt warm, held, seen. I love you, she said. It was the first time she had said it without hesitation, without fear, without waiting for him to say it first. He kissed her forehead. I know. I have known since the kitchen. Then why did you not say anything? Because I wanted you to say it when you were ready, and now you have. She laughed. The sound was carried away by the wind, out over the sea, into the vastness of a world that had once seemed too big for her. She was not small anymore. She had never been small. She had only been hiding. She stopped hiding. The years that followed were not perfect. There were arguments. There were misunderstandings. There were nights when Eleanor doubted herself, when she wondered if she was really the woman Alexander thought she was, when she felt the old pull of invisibility, the temptation to disappear into the background. But she did not disappear. She stayed. She argued. She apologized. She forgave. She built a life not on the foundation of a perfect fairy tale, but on the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, day after day, year after year. She learned to ride a horse, badly. She learned to dance, passably. She learned to host a dinner party, to manage a household, to navigate the treacherous waters of the Tun without losing herself. She did not become the perfect duchess. She became something better, herself. And Alexander, who had started as a man who did not know how to be seen without his title, learned from her. He learned to admit when he was wrong. He learned to ask for help. He learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. They had children, a son who had his father's seriousness and his mother's quiet strength, and a daughter who was fearless in a way that made Eleanor both proud and terrified. They raised them not in the grandeur of the London townhouse, but in the gardens and kitchens and libraries of the country estate, teaching them that worth was not inherited but earned, that visibility was not a threat but a gift. The daughter asked once, when she was 12, why her mother was so quiet in company. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of the rain. She thought of the wheel. She thought of the years of silence. Your mother is not quiet, Alexander said, stepping into the room. She is listening, and she sees everything. Never mistake her silence for weakness. The daughter nodded, accepting this, and ran off to the garden. Eleanor looked at Alexander. You still see me? I will always see you, he said. It is the only thing I have ever been good at. She smiled, and in her smile was all the gratitude and love and stubborn joy of a woman who had once been invisible and had learned, at last, to be seen. The story does not end there. Stories never really end. They continue in the small moments, the ordinary days, the quiet evenings when the fire crackles and the children sleep, and two people sit together in the comfortable silence of a life fully lived. Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ashbourne, sat on the terrace of her home on a summer evening, watching the stars appear one by one. Alexander sat beside her, his hand in hers, his thumb tracing the same small circles he had traced on the night of their first ball. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about the question. She thought about the carriage wheel, the rain, the kitchen, the church. She thought about the years of hiding and the years of being found. She thought about the daughter who was fearless and the son who was serious and the husband who had never stopped looking at her with wonder. "I am not happy the way I thought I would be," she said. "I am happy in a way I did not know existed. It is quieter, deeper. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It simply is." He squeezed her hand. "That is the best kind," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars continued to emerge. The night continued to deepen, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had once been invisible, glowed in the darkness like a light that had finally been allowed to burn. The story of Eleanor Ashworth did not end on that terrace, though the image of two people holding hands beneath the stars would have been a satisfying enough conclusion. But the truth is that the most important transformations happen long after the wedding, long after the first kiss, long after the world has stopped watching. They happen in the quiet spaces between moments, in the decisions that no one else sees, in the private rebellions that leave no mark on history except the shape of a life changed forever. There was a morning, 3 years into the marriage, when Eleanor woke to find Alexander already dressed standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. She knew that posture. It was the posture he used when he was preparing to deliver difficult news. She sat up. The fire had burned low. The room was cold. "What has happened?" He turned, his face was drawn. "A letter from your mother. Your father is ill. The physician says he has weeks, perhaps less." The news did not shock her. Her father had been declining for months, his breath growing shorter, his color fading to a gray that no amount of firelight could warm. She had visited him twice since the wedding, and each time she had left with the same hollow feeling, the same unspoken farewell. She dressed quickly. She packed a small bag. Alexander ordered the carriage. The journey took 2 days. When they arrived, the house seemed smaller than she remembered, shabbier, the wallpaper more faded, the curtains more frayed. Her mother met them at the door, thinner than Eleanor had ever seen her. Her eyes red-rimmed but her composure intact. "He has been asking for you," her mother said. "He has been asking for days." Eleanor climbed the stairs alone. The bedroom was dim, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the smell of sickness and wood smoke. Her father lay in the bed, reduced to a skeleton, his hands resting on the blanket like fallen leaves. She sat beside him. She took his hand. It was light, fragile, barely a hand at all. "I am here," she said. His eyes opened. They were clouded, distant, but they found her face, and something in them sharpened. "My invisible daughter," he said. His voice was a whisper, rough and thin. "You came. I always come." He smiled. It was a ghost of a smile, barely there, but it transformed his face in a way she had not seen in years. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about so many things." She did not ask what he meant. She knew. She had always known. "I thought Lydia was the one who would save us," he continued, each word costing him visible effort. "I thought she was the prize. I did not see that you were the one holding everything together. I did not see that you were the one who lifted the weight. It does not matter now." "It matters," he said. His grip tightened, surprising her with its strength. "It matters because I am dying, and I do not want to die with this lie between us. You were always the stronger one, you were always the better one, and I never told you." She did not cry. She had spent too many years learning not to cry, but something inside her loosened, a knot she had carried since childhood, a knot she had not known was there. "I forgive you," she said. "I forgave you long ago." He closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. She stayed with him through the night, through the hours of darkness, through the moments when his breath caught and she thought he was gone, only for him to draw another shaky breath. Alexander brought her tea. Her mother brought her a shawl. The house creaked and settled around her like a living thing. He died at dawn with the first light of morning filtering through the curtains. His hand went slack in hers. The breath that left him did not return. Eleanor sat for a long time after he was gone. She did not weep. She sat in the silence, holding his hand, feeling the cold creep into his fingers. She thought about the carriage wheel. She thought about the rain. She thought about the years of silence, the years of service, the years of being the daughter no one saw. And she thought about the gift he had given her in the end, the acknowledgement, the apology, the words she had never expected to hear. She rose. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The sun was rising over the fields, painting the world in gold and pink. The frost on the grass sparkled like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Alexander was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply opened his arms and she walked into them, and they stood together in the doorway of her childhood home while the sun rose on a world that had lost one man and gained something Eleanor could not yet name. The funeral was held 3 days later. Lydia attended, seated in the front pew beside her mother, her face composed and pale. She had married a vicar from a neighbouring county, a quiet man with kind eyes who looked at her the way Alexander looked at Eleanor. They had a son. They were happy, in the quiet way that comes after storms. Eleanor stood at the grave and watched them lower her father into the earth. She did not cry. She had already said goodbye. Afterward she walked through the house one last time. The rooms were empty now, stripped of the clutter of a lifetime. Her father's study smelled of old books and dust. The kitchen smelled of bread, because the cook had not stopped working, had not stopped feeding the family, had not stopped doing what she always did. Eleanor found her mother in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil. The same soil Eleanor had knelt in a lifetime ago, planting rosemary with a duke who had refused to ruin his boots. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. Her mother looked up. There was dirt on her cheek, and her hair was coming loose from its pins. She looked older than Eleanor remembered, but she also looked stronger, as if grief had carved away the softness and left something harder beneath. "I will stay," her mother said. "I will tend the garden. I will live out my days in this house with the ghosts and the memories." She paused. "And I will try to remember that I had 2 daughters, not 1. Eleanor knelt beside her. She took her mother's hands, dirty and cold and familiar. "You do not need to earn my forgiveness," Eleanor said. "It is already given." Her mother's face crumpled. She wept, finally, the tears she had been holding back for days, for years, for a lifetime. Eleanor held her, and the garden was quiet, and the sun was warm, and the world continued to turn. They stayed for a week after the funeral. Eleanor helped her mother sort through her father's belongings. She found letters, old photographs, a pressed flower from a summer she did not remember. She found a drawing she had made as a child, a crude sketch of a house and a tree and a small figure standing alone in the corner. Her father had kept it. He had kept it for 30 years. She took it with her when she left. The carriage ride home was quiet. Alexander sat across from her, watching her with those eyes that saw everything. He did not speak. He knew she needed silence, not words. But as the estate came into view, as the familiar towers rose against the sky, she reached across and took his hand. "I am ready to go home," she said. "You are home," he said. "You have always been home." She smiled. It was a small smile, a tired smile, but it was real. The years continued to pass. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, in an endless cycle of growth and decay and renewal. Eleanor's hair began to grey. Alexander's limp grew more pronounced. Their children grew taller, wiser, more independent. The daughter, whose name was Rosalind, married a naval officer and moved to Cornwall, where she wrote long letters about the sea and the cliffs and the wild beauty of the coast. The son, whose name was William, took over the management of the estate with a seriousness that made his father proud and his mother wistful. And Eleanor and Alexander grew old together. They grew old in the garden, where they still planted rosemary every spring. They grew old in the library, where he read aloud and she listened with her eyes closed. They grew old on the terrace, where they watched the stars and held hands and spoke of small things and large things, and the shape of a life shared. On the morning of their 25th wedding anniversary, Alexander woke before her. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff, his movements careful. He walked to the kitchen and asked the cook for a tray. He prepared it himself, the way he had not done in decades, bread with butter, a pot of tea, a single rose from the garden. He carried it to their bedroom and set it on the table beside the bed. He sat down and waited for her to wake. She opened her eyes. The light was soft. The room was warm. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the kitchen, the way he had looked at her in the church, the way a man looks at something precious he has been searching for his entire life. 25 years, he said. 25 years, she repeated. I would do it again, he said. Every moment, every struggle, every sleepless night. I would do it all again, just to end up here, in this room, with you. She sat up. She took his hand. Her fingers were soft now, lined with age, marked by a life well lived. You never stopped looking, she said. I never will. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a perfect kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had been kissing each other for 25 years, who knew each other's rhythms, who had learned to speak without words. And when she pulled back, she saw that he was crying. What is it? She asked. I am just grateful, he said, that you lifted that wheel, that you disappeared into the rain, that you let me find you. She wiped the tears from his cheeks with her thumb. Her own eyes were wet, but she did not let them fall. I did not let you find me, she said. You found me because you were looking. That is the difference. He nodded. He understood. He had always understood. They spent the anniversary walking through the gardens, visiting the tenants, sitting by the lake where the swans had nested for as long as anyone could remember. Their children came home for dinner, bringing grandchildren and laughter, and the chaos of a family that had grown beyond anything Eleanor had imagined. That night, after the guests had left and the house had fallen silent, Eleanor stood alone in the library. The fire had burned down to embers. The books rose around her, dark and silent, holding the stories of 1,000 other lives. She walked to the window and looked out at the night. The stars were out, bright and cold and distant. She thought of her father, of the carriage wheel, of the rain that had changed everything. She thought of her mother, still alive, still tending the garden, still writing letters that arrived every week without fail. She thought of Lydia, who had found her own happiness, her own peace. She thought of Alexander sleeping upstairs, his hand resting on the pillow where her head had been. She thought of the woman she had been, invisible, silent, afraid. And she thought of the woman she had become. She did not know how to end the thought. There was no neat conclusion, no perfect final sentence. Life did not work that way. It continued, it unfolded, it surprised. But she knew one thing, with a certainty that had grown stronger with every passing year. She was no longer invisible. She had not been invisible for a long time. She had been seen. And that, she realized, was the only ending that mattered. She turned from the window. She climbed the stairs. She slipped into bed beside her husband, who stirred and reached for her without opening his eyes, his hand finding hers in the darkness. She closed her eyes. She listened to his breathing, slow and steady, the rhythm of a life shared. And she slept deeply and peacefully, the sleep of a woman who had finally stopped hiding, who had finally been found, who had finally allowed herself to be loved. The fire crackled. The stars turned. The night wrapped around the house like a blanket, and Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ashbourne, who had once been invisible, glowed in the darkness like a light that had been burning all along.